Episode 4 of Studio Effects, I'm going to talk about distortion and what that is. Essentially, distortion is quite a word in common parlance. You know, a non-musician or engineer will say whether a sound is distorted or not. What they mean is it's not the sound they wanted to hear, necessarily. It could be a sound that's completely different from the output. Now, that means that any coloration, like EQing, could be viewed as a form of distortion because it's changing the sound into something else. Now, distortion in common sort of studio parlance and musician parlance is to overload an audio circuit so that you don't get a clean sound anymore. You get something that's a bit more gritty. Now, I've got my Telecaster here. As you can see on the screen, I've got a Vox AC30 plugin, and the control on the far left, marked gain, is right up. Now, what this is doing, because this is a simulation of a valve amp, is it's wildly adding lots and lots of harmonics to the signal. That's kind of what distortion's doing. If I turn it all the way down, take the master up so that you can still hear it, it's now clean. Well, very slightly sort of flabby with the louder sort of playing there. But essentially, as I ramp the gain up, what it does is it not only makes it louder, but actually it adds harmonics to the signal. A valve amp adds even harmonics to your signal. The next distortion I'm going to show you is Logic's own distortion, which is called Distortion, interestingly enough. And I'm going to do it on the Rhodes instead. Now, this is a transistor distortion. So this time you're getting a lot of odd harmonics out of your output. So straight through. A very basic electric piano sound. But if I add some distortion, it can really wake those harmonics up again, but they'll be odd ones. Some distortion plugins have a level compensation because actually when you distort something, the overall sound output is a little bit higher, but the peaks are removed, so you get kind of a similar sound anyway, and that's what the level compensation does. Ooh. Picked up the keys of the Rhodes. Whoa. Yeah, that's, not intensely desirable, but perhaps if we had a little bit and I was playing a solo, it might wake up some of that top end. We have a tone control here, which the lower the tone is, the more sort of realistic it is as an overdrive, because if I open it all the way up, it can make it sound a bit too fuzzy. And so if I just sort of ramp the gain up a little bit, I can play so that some of the sounds, some of the notes are distorted and others aren't. So it's adding extra expression, actually, to my sound. Now, that is the distortion, which is essentially sort of simulating the behavior of a standard bipolar transistor. If I go to Overdrive, this is a bit more subtle because it's overloading something called a field effect transistor, or FET. So actually the sound is a little bit more refined and less intense. And I can reverse it, I can play with the tone as well. So that's just allowed a few more of those harmonics to come through. Now, there are other forms of distortion, and I'm going to talk about these as well. We've got all these sort of things here. We've got the bit crusher. Now, we now record audio digitally. What does that mean? Well, we sample wherever the volume is at a particular time. So the time that we sample, the number of times we sample something over a given time period is the sampling frequency or sample rate. And the volume at which we are able to store, all of the different volume levels that we can store are called bit depth. So usually we record now at 24-bit, so it's very, very clean. If you just look at the graphical representation as I lower it, you can see that the thing becomes much more stepped. That's because it's only able to store a few different volume levels. 2 to the power of 24 volume levels, which is the number of volumes you can store, that's about 17 million odd something. It's huge. 16-bit is CD quality, which is 65,000 odd different volume levels, and it's still very good. But as we come down here, it starts to get a bit apparent that something's not quite right. So, Fender Rhodes at 24-bit. Fender Rhodes at 8-bit. You can hear there's quite a lot of quantization noise. Actually, it's 7-bit, but yeah, essentially, as I keep going further down. You think, well, why do you have this? You know, here we are recording 24-bit. Why would you want 3-bit resolution? Well, I don't know. Why would you? You could add some fuzziness to it. If I took the mix down, I could add little bits into it. Or I could follow it with an equalizer that can take some of that sort of fuzziness away, so you end up with a bit of distortion. Hence the fact that it's in the distortion rack. Now, I can drive I've got a little bit of a distortion overdrive as well. So essentially, I can simulate the level overloading a digital system, which of course you can never do without it sounding pretty awful. Now, if I go resolution 24-bit, I'm going to play with the downsampling. Now, this is basically what happens if you halve the sample rate. Quarter it. Now, what that's called is aliasing, where it puts, essentially, you can hear a note being mixed in. And that note doesn't change. Although that's not intensely desirable, if I was just playing a single line on a synth that needed a bit of waking up, you can use your downsampler for that. So there is that sort of downsampling thing. Now, we've got all sorts of other things available. Distortion, clip distortion. What clipping is to round off the top of a sine wave. And this is a bit more subtle than the distortion and the overdrive. Can't really hear anything there. It's just smoothing off the top of those sine waves, as you can see here with this graphical representation. It's very much more subtle and quite a nice effect. If you strap that onto your output mix with the tone rolled off, you could get that sort of lo-fi effect. There are people that say, well, why do you want lo-fi? Well, it's genre specific. You know, I wouldn't record gypsy jazz at 24-bit, 48 kilohertz. I'd record it with a telephone mouthpiece like I used to do, because I want the sound of a 10-inch shellac record. That's another form of distortion, of course. If you've got a gramophone record, it's intensely distorted, because what was recorded in the studio in 1935 is a hell of a lot different to what you'd hear from your record. So that's another form of distortion. I do actually have something called Vinyl Strip by Audio Thing, which puts some record crackle on. You've got some drive on that as well. Now that I've driven that, you can can hear that vinyl crackling. You can decide between odd harmonics and even harmonics. That's great. So odd for transistors, even for valves. And you can have any mix in between. There is masses that you can do to change your sounds, and distortion isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's very often a good thing. So there we go.